The storm came without warning that night in northern Canada, and Jake Morrison was already deep in the forest when the sky turned violent and angry with lightning. He worked as a search and rescue specialist in these remote areas, and he knew these woods better than anyone alive, but even he had never seen a storm like this one before. The trees bent sideways under the force of wind that screamed through the branches, and the rain fell so hard it felt like stones hitting his jacket. Then, he saw something that made no sense at all, because a streak of fire cut through the black clouds above him, and it was falling fast and burning bright like a meteor, but it was moving wrong and changing direction as if something was trying to control its descent. The object crashed into the forest about 2 miles from where Jake stood, and the impact shook the ground beneath his boots and sent birds screaming into the night sky. Jake knew he should call it in to his base station, but something inside him said there was no time for that now, so he started running toward the crash site through mud and fallen branches while his flashlight beam cut through the darkness ahead of him. It took him nearly 30 minutes of hard running to reach the location, and when he finally broke through the tree line into a clearing, he stopped dead in his tracks. The ship was like nothing he had ever seen in his life, and it was not from Earth, and there was no doubt about that anymore. The hull was made of some kind of silver metal that seemed to glow with its own light, even though parts of it were torn open and smoking from the crash. Strange symbols covered the surface, and they pulsed with a faint blue energy that made his eyes hurt when he looked at them too long. Jake moved closer with his medical kit in hand, because that was what he did, and he saved people no matter who they were or where they came from. He climbed through a breach in the hull, and inside the ship was even stranger than the outside, with walls that curved in impossible ways and controls that looked like they were made of liquid crystal, frozen in place. That was when he found her, lying on the floor near what looked like some kind of pilot seat, and Jake felt his breath catch in his throat because she was the most beautiful and most alien thing he had ever seen. Her skin had a pale quality to it that seemed to shimmer even in the dim emergency lighting of the dying ship, and her hair was silver white and spread around her head like a halo. Her ears came to elegant points, and her features were so perfect, they looked almost unreal, like something from an old fairy tale his grandmother used to tell him. But she was dying, and Jake could see that right away from the way her breathing came in short gasps and from the strange purple blood that leaked from a wound in her side. Near her feet lay a small creature that looked like a dragon from those same old stories, and it was scaled and had wings folded against its back, and it was barely breathing at all. Jake did not hesitate, even though his training told him this was dangerous and possibly contaminated, because his instincts as a rescuer were stronger than his fear. He pulled out his medical supplies and started working on the woman first, and he found that her biology was surprisingly similar to human anatomy in the ways that mattered. He cleaned the wound and applied pressure bandages, and gave her an injection of antibiotics that he hoped would not kill her but might keep her alive long enough to get real help. The small dragon opened one eye when Jake moved to check on it next, and the creature made a sound that was part purr and part growl, but it did not try to bite him or burn him with fire like dragons were supposed to do in the stories. Instead, it seemed to understand that Jake was trying to help, and it let him examine its injuries, which were mostly bruises and one broken wing bone that Jake carefully splinted using materials from his kit. Jake knew he had to move them both before the authorities showed up, because whoever this woman was, she had crashed here running from something. And Jake had a feeling that human military forces asking questions would not be good for her health right now. He fashioned a stretcher from emergency blankets and somehow managed to get both the woman and her dragon companion onto it, and then he began the long, hard journey back to his cabin, which was another 3 miles through the forest. The time Jake reached his cabin, the storm had passed and dawn was breaking over the mountains, and he was exhausted beyond anything he had felt in years. He carried the woman inside and laid her on his bed and put the small dragon in a box lined with blankets near the fireplace. Then he started a fire and made coffee and tried to figure out what he was going to do next, because he had just rescued an alien and her pet dragon and hidden them from his own government. The woman slept for 2 days straight while Jake watched over her and changed her bandages and made sure she kept breathing. The dragon recovered faster, and by the second day it was walking around the cabin exploring everything with curious eyes and making soft chirping sounds that reminded Jake of birds, but deeper and more musical. The creature seemed to have bonded with Jake somehow, and it followed him everywhere and slept, curled up on his feet at night, and The third morning, Jake woke to find the woman sitting up in bed and looking at him, with eyes that were the color of liquid gold and held more intelligence and pain than any eyes he had ever seen before. She spoke, and her voice was like music, but the words were in a language he did not know at first. Then she tried again, and this time the words were in English, but heavily accented and clearly difficult for her. She told him her name was Lyria, and she was from a place called Elisar, and her people had been fighting a terrible war against creatures called the Zalthun for longer than she could remember. She said her ship had been damaged in a battle, and she had fled through space trying to find somewhere safe to hide and repair, but the enemy had followed her and shot her down over this world. Then Lyria looked at Jake with those gold eyes, and she said something that made his blood run cold and his heart race at the same time. She said that among her people, there was an ancient law and custom about life, bonds, and when someone saved another person from certain death in a moment of pure selflessness, then a connection was formed between them that could never be broken. She said that from the moment Jake had pulled her from that burning ship and given his own medicine to keep her alive, he had become something special to her people. She said he had become her mate and that their lives were now linked together forever, whether he wanted that or not, because that was how the bond worked, and there was no way to undo it once it was formed. Jake wanted to argue and say that was crazy and he had just been doing his job as a rescuer, but when Lyria reached out and touched his hand, he felt something pass between them like electricity, but softer and warmer, and he knew somehow that she was telling him the truth. The small dragon that Lyria called Ember came over and nuzzled both of them and made a happy sound, and Jake realized that his life had just changed in ways he could not even begin to understand yet. He had saved an alien woman from death, and now she was telling him they were bonded for life, and somewhere out in space there was an enemy coming that wanted to kill her, and probably him too now that he was involved. Jake looked at Lyria and at Ember and then out the window at the peaceful forest morning, and he made a decision that would change not just his life but the fate of his entire world. He said he would help her and protect her and figure out what to do next, because that was what you did when someone needed you, and it did not matter if they were human or alien or anything else. What Jake did not know yet was that their enemy was already coming, and Earth had less than 3 months before the Zalthun arrived in force, and that he and Lyria and little Ember would be the only thing standing between humanity and complete destruction. Jake knew that hiding in his cabin with Lyria and Ember would not keep them safe for long, because the military would eventually find the crash site and start looking for survivors, and when they did, it would only be a matter of time before someone tracked them to his home in the woods, and then everything would get very complicated. Very fast, Lyria told him they needed to warn the people of Earth about what was coming, and she explained that the Zalthun were not just raiders or simple invaders, but something far worse, and they were a hive mind that consumed entire civilizations and turned them into more of themselves. And once they found a world, they never stopped until every living thing was either dead or assimilated into the swarm. Jake made the decision to take Lyria to the military base at NORAD, because if anyone would listen to a warning about alien invasion, it would be them, and he used his old contacts from his time in the Air Force to get a meeting with General Rebecca Hayes, who had always respected his judgment even when others thought he was crazy. The meeting did not go well at first because General Hayes looked at Lyria with a mixture of wonder and deep suspicion, and she asked hard questions about why they should believe any of this was real and not some elaborate hoax or foreign spy operation. And Jake could see that half the officers in the room thought Lyria was wearing makeup and contacts, and that Ember was some kind of trained lizard. Then Lyria did something that changed everything, and she touched a panel on her arm that Jake had thought was just a bracelet, and suddenly a hologram appeared in the center of the room, showing the fall of her home world, and everyone in that conference room watched in silence as beautiful cities burned and millions of people died, and the Zalthun swarm covered the planet like a living nightmare. Colonel Ben Murphy was the first to speak after the hologram faded, and he said this could all be fake and computer-generated, and they needed to detain Lyria for study and questioning. And Jake felt anger rise in his chest, because he knew what Murphy really meant was that they wanted to take her apart and see how she worked. General Hayes was more cautious, and she called in Dr. Sophie Chen, who was the best xenobiologist in the country, and asked her to examine Lyria and verify whether she was really alien or just very good theater. And Dr. Chen spent 3 hours running tests and taking samples, and when she came back, Her hands were shaking with excitement because everything about Lyria was genuinely alien, and her DNA was completely different from anything on Earth. While the military debated what to do, Jake and Lyria spent time together, and the mate bond between them grew stronger with each passing day. And Jake found he could sense her emotions even when she was in another room, and sometimes he caught flashes of her thoughts in his mind like distant radio signals, and it frightened him at first, but Lyria explained this was normal for bonded pairs among her people. Ember was growing at an alarming rate, and within 2 weeks the small dragon that had fit in a box was now the size of a large dog, and his scales had darkened from pale blue to deep cobalt, and he could breathe small jets of flame when he got excited or scared. And Dr. Chen discovered that star dragons were silicon-based life forms that ate radiation instead of regular food, which explained why Ember liked to sleep near the nuclear reactor at the base. The debate about whether to believe Lyria ended suddenly when radar detected something entering Earth atmosphere over Alaska, and it was not a meteor or space debris, but a controlled entry, and 3 objects landed in the small town of Cold Bay, and then all communication from that town went dark and silent. General Hayes sent Jake and Lyria with a special forces team led by Captain Kyle Turner to investigate what had happened. And when they arrived in Cold Bay, they found something out of a horror movie, because the town looked normal at first glance. But when they got closer, they realized all the people were wrong, and they moved in jerky, unnatural ways, and their eyes had a milky film over them. Lyria explained these were the Zalthun scouts, and they had already begun the process of taking over the human hosts. And in a few more days, these people would be completely consumed and transformed into something that was neither human nor alien, but a terrible mixture of both, and the only way to stop them was to kill them before the transformation completed. The hunt through Cold Bay was like nothing Jake had ever experienced, and it was worse than any combat he had seen in his military days, because these things looked like people he might know, and they spoke with human voices and begged for help. But Lyria could sense the Zalthun presence inside them, and she knew they were already lost and beyond. Saving Captain Turner and his team were professionals, but even they struggled with what they had to do. And Jake saw one young soldier freeze when he recognized his own cousin among the infected, and Turner had to make the hard call and take the shot himself, and afterward that soldier sat down and cried, and nobody said anything, because they all understood. Ember proved his worth during the hunt, because the young dragon could sense the Zalthun parasites, even when they were hidden inside human hosts, and he would growl and point with his snout, and his scales would glow brighter when he detected them. And twice he saved the team from ambushes by infected townspeople who were trying to surround them. The fighting got worse as they pushed deeper into town, and the Zalthun realized they were being hunted, and they started to fight back with coordination that proved the hive mind was already forming among the infected, and Lyria fought like nothing Jake had ever seen before, and she moved faster than human eyes could follow, and her energy weapons cut through the infected with surgical precision. Jake used his tactical training to set traps and create choke points, and he found ways to turn the town itself into a weapon against the enemy, and he flooded basements to drown infected hiding below, and he collapsed buildings to crush groups of them, and he used propane tanks as improvised explosives, and Captain Turner started calling him the mad genius. They found the source of the infection in an old cannery building, where 3 Zalthun pods had landed, and these were not the small parasites, but actual alien creatures that looked like masses of black tentacles and teeth, and they were pumping out spores into the air, trying to infect as many humans as possible before they could be stopped. Ember attacked the pods with fury that surprised everyone, and the dragon had grown large enough now that his plasma breath could melt steel, and he incinerated 2 of the pods before they could react, and Jake and Lyria worked together to destroy the third one, using a combination of human explosives and Elisari energy weapons. Just when they thought it was over, Colonel Murphy appeared with another team of soldiers, and he pointed weapons at Lyria and Ember and said they were too dangerous to be left free, and that he was taking them into custody for the safety of Earth. And Jake realized with horror that Murphy had been planning this all along and had used the mission as cover to capture Lyria. Jake had to make a choice between following orders and protecting the woman who had become more important to him than he ever thought possible, and he chose Lyria, and he drew his weapon on his own people, and Captain Turner hesitated for only a moment before he and his team sided with Jake against Murphy, and they became fugitives in that moment. They escaped in a stolen helicopter with Murphy shouting threats behind them, and Jake knew they had just made enemies of the very people they were trying to save. But Lyria touched his hand and the mate bond flared warm between them, and he knew he had made the right choice, even if it cost him everything. They flew north into the wilderness, trying to figure out what to do next, and Ember rode in the cargo bay, growing more anxious with every mile. And then suddenly the young dragon threw back his head and screamed, not with his voice, but with his mind. And Jake and Lyria both felt the psychic blast of terror, and warning. Lyria went pale and grabbed Jake's arm, and she told him that Ember had just received a vision through the dragon ancestral memory, and the main Zalthun fleet had entered the solar system, and they numbered in. The thousands of ships on Earth had less than 3 months before they arrived, and maybe less than that. If the fleet decided to accelerate their approach, Jake looked out the helicopter window at the peaceful Earth below, and he knew that everything was about to change, and the war that had destroyed Lyria homeworld was coming here, and humanity had no idea what was about to hit them, and the only people who could warn them were now fugitives running from their own military. The helicopter flew on through the cold northern sky, carrying 3 unlikely heroes toward an uncertain future, and behind them the Zalthun fleet drew closer with each passing moment, like a storm of teeth and hunger that would not stop until it had consumed everything. The world changed overnight when telescopes around Earth captured images of the Zalthun fleet, and suddenly what had seemed impossible became terrifyingly real, and every news channel showed the same footage of alien ships gathering near Mars. And the debate about whether Lyria was telling the truth ended immediately, because the proof was right there in the sky for everyone to see. General Hayes personally flew to meet Jake and Lyria at their hiding spot in northern Canada, and she brought a full pardon signed by the president himself, and she told them that Earth needed their help desperately because humanity had never fought anything like this before, and they were going to lose unless they learned fast and fought smart. Colonel Murphy was stripped of his command for his attempted betrayal, and he was reassigned to a desk job. But something unexpected happened, because Murphy came to Jake privately and admitted he had been wrong, and said fear had made him stupid, and he asked if there was any way he could help in the real fight that was coming. And Jake saw genuine regret in the man's eyes and decided everyone deserved a second chance. The military set up a war council, and Jake found himself sitting at a table with generals and admirals and world leaders, and it felt surreal. But Lyria stood beside him, and the mate bond gave him confidence he never knew he had, and he started speaking about tactics and strategy, and people listened because he and Lyria had actually fought the Zalthun and won. Even if it was just a small battle, Dr. Chen brought news that changed everything when she announced that Lyria was not the only alien refugee in the galaxy, and her deep space scanners had detected distress signals from other ships fleeing the Zalthun advance, and some of them were heading toward Earth because word had spread somehow that humanity was preparing to make a standover. The next month, ships started arriving, and each one brought survivors from worlds that had fallen to the swarm, and there were the Vorai, who looked like living crystals and communicated through light patterns, and the Keth, who were amphibious and needed water tanks to survive, but were brilliant engineers, and even a few other Elisari warships that had escaped the destruction of their homeworld. Jake became the unlikely ambassador between all these different species, because his bond with Lyria gave him insights into how aliens thought and felt, and he could sense emotions through the mate bond, and that helped him understand what others needed even when language barriers made communication difficult, and the refugees started calling him the bridge builder. General Hayes proposed a radical plan that seemed insane but might be their only chance, and she said Earth should become the rallying point for all free species, and they would use the planet as bait to draw the Zalthun into a massive trap, and humanity would provide the industrial capacity to build weapons while the other species provided technology and knowledge. The plan had risks because it meant bringing the war directly to Earth, but the alternative was watching each species fall one by one until nothing was left. And Jake argued in favor of the plan because he said humanity had always done best when backed into a corner with no choice but to fight or die, and Lyria agreed because she had seen how fierce humans could be. Ember continued growing at a pace that amazed everyone, and within 6 weeks the dragon was the size of a small airplane, and his scales had become dark as midnight and radiated heat that could be felt from 20 feet away. And Dr. Chen discovered the dragon growth was linked to the emotional states of his bonded companions, and Ember was growing fast because he could feel Jake determination and Lyria, warrior spirit, through their connection. The young dragon became a symbol of hope for the Alliance because here was a creature of immense power that chose to fight alongside them, and Ember seemed to understand his role, and he would fly over the military bases performing aerial displays that boosted morale, and children would point at the sky and cheer when they saw him. Lyria began training human soldiers in Elisari combat techniques, and she taught them how to move faster and strike harder and think 3 steps ahead of the enemy, and at first the soldiers struggled because her methods were so different from human military doctrine. But those who survived her training became elite fighters that other units called the Silver Squad. In honor of Lyria, Silver Hair, Jake learned from Lyria too, and she taught him about Elisari technology and weapons and strategy. And through the mate, bond information passed between them faster than normal teaching, and sometimes Jake would know things without being told, and Lyria said this was the bond deepening and their minds becoming more connected. The romantic feelings between them grew stronger with each passing day, and Jake found himself thinking about Lyria even when she was not around, and he would catch himself smiling at memories of her laugh or the way she moved. And one night under the stars, Jake told Lyria that the mate bond might have brought them together, but he was choosing to stay because he loved her, and not because of any alien magic. Lyria cried when he said that, and she told him through the bond that she had been afraid he only tolerated her because of the bond. And she showed him memories through their connection of watching him work with the refugee species and seeing his kindness and bravery. And she said she had fallen in love with the human who refused to give up no matter how bad things looked. They kissed for the first time that night, and Jake felt the mate bond flare like fire between them, and suddenly he could see through her eyes and feel what she felt, and taste her emotions like colors in his mind, and it was overwhelming, and beautiful and terrifying all at once. Captain Turner had become Jake's closest human friend, and he led the Special Forces teams that worked directly with the alien refugees, and Turner's wife and children had been evacuated to a bunker in Colorado. But he stayed to fight because he said someone had to stand up for Earth, and Jake respected him more than almost anyone he knew. Dr. Chen made breakthrough after breakthrough by combining human engineering with alien technology, and she developed hybrid weapons that fired Elisari energy bolts from human rifle platforms, and she created armor that used Vori crystal matrices to disperse energy impacts, and she built ships that merged Keth propulsion systems with human hulls. The preparations went on day and night, and factories that once made cars now made weapons, and shipyards that built cargo vessels now constructed warships, and humanity mobilized like never before in history, and old enemies became allies because the Zalthun threatened everyone equally. But not everything went smoothly, and there were problems with refugees who did not trust each other because their species had old grudges from before the Zalthun came, and there were humans who feared the aliens and wanted them gone. And there were arguments about resources and territory and 100 other things that threatened to tear the fragile alliance apart. Jake spent as much time mediating disputes as he did planning for war, and he learned that being a leader meant listening more than talking and finding compromises that left everyone slightly unhappy, but willing to work together. And Lyria helped him navigate the complex politics of multiple species and cultures. Then everything almost fell apart when Lieutenant Claire Brooks from military intelligence discovered something horrible, and she found evidence that the Zalthun had already infiltrated Earth government, and there were sleeper agents working in positions of power, and they had been sabotaging defense preparations and sending information to the approaching fleet. The paranoia that followed nearly destroyed the alliance, because suddenly everyone suspected everyone else, and humans accused aliens of being spies, and aliens accused humans of betrayal, and trust evaporated like water in the desert, and Jake watched months of work crumble in days. General Hayes ordered a massive security sweep, and they found 17 infiltrators among the humans, and 5 among the refugees, and each one was exposed using technology provided by Lyria that could detect Zalthun contamination, and the executions were swift and necessary, but they left scars on everyone involved. Colonel Murphy redeemed himself during the purge because he personally uncovered 3 sleeper agents in his old unit, and he said he would not let his earlier mistakes compound by allowing traitors to destroy Earth from within. and Jake began to respect the man who had once tried to capture Lyria. The Zalthun fleet crossed Mars orbit, and suddenly the timeline became very real, and they had maybe 2 months before the invasion began, and everyone knew they were not ready, but they would have to be ready anyway because the enemy would not wait on. The night before the final battle preparations were set to begin, Ember suddenly took flight with an urgency that made Jake and Lyria drop everything and climb onto his back, and the dragon flew them across half the world to the Himalayan mountains. And Jake had no idea what was happening, but he trusted Ember instinct. The dragon landed in a hidden valley that looked like it had not been touched in thousands of years, and there among ancient ruins was an entrance to something that made Lyria gasp because she recognized the symbols, and she said this was an archive, and her people had built vaults like this across the galaxy to preserve knowledge. They entered the archive, and inside was technology so advanced it made everything else look primitive, and there were holographic records of Elisari history going back millions of years, and battle plans against the Zalthun, and scientific data and cultural memories, and most importantly, the psychic vault inside the ancient archive pulsed with energy that made Jake's teeth ache and his eyes water, and Lyria stood before it with her hand raised, and he could feel through the mate bond how much she feared what came next, because opening this vault would burn through her mind like fire and might leave her dead or broken beyond repair. Dr. Chen had set up equipment around them, and she explained that the mate bond was a psychic connection that linked 2 minds together, and if they both tried to open the vault at the same time, the load would be split between them, and they might survive what would kill one person alone. But she admitted she had no idea if this would actually work. Jake took Lyria's hand and felt the bond flare bright and warm between them, and he told her through their connection that they would do this together, just like they had done everything else. And she smiled at him with tears in her golden eyes, and said she had never imagined finding someone like him when she fled. Her dying world Ember moved close to them both, and the dragon did something unexpected because he pressed his massive head against their joined hands, and suddenly, Jake felt a third presence in the bond, and he realized Ember was offering his own dragon consciousness to help stabilize the connection. And Lyria gasped, because this had never been done before in all of Elisari history. The 3 of them together touched the psychic vault, and the world exploded into light, and pain and information, and Jake felt like his brain was being torn apart and rebuilt at the same time, and he saw thousands of years of history flash through his mind, and he experienced the fall of civilizations and the birth of empires and the long, slow war against the Zalthun that had consumed the galaxy. Through the connection, he felt Lyria screaming and Ember roaring, and he wanted to let go, but he knew if he did, they would all die. So he held on with everything he had and pushed deeper into the vault, and finally at the center of all that chaos, he found what they needed. And he saw the coordinates to the Zalthun birth world and the technical specifications of the AI core, and most importantly, the tactical approach needed to destroy it. When they finally broke free from the vault, Jake collapsed to the ground, and his hands were shaking so badly he could not make them stop, and he realized dimly that something was wrong with his nervous system, and the damage might be permanent. And beside him Lyria was crying and touching her face, and when she looked at him, he saw that one of her golden eyes had turned milky white and blind. Ember lay between them, barely breathing, and his scales had lost their glow, and Jake could feel through the bond that the dragon growth had stopped and might never restart, because the psychic strain had damaged something fundamental in Ember biology. But they were all alive, and they had the information they needed. Dr. Chen helped them back to the transport, and during the flight back to base, Jake downloaded everything he had learned from the vault into the computer systems, and the military analysts went to work immediately, planning an assault on the Zalthun birth world, while Earth prepared for the invasion that was now only weeks away. The Zalthun fleet reached Earth-Moon and stopped there for 3 days, as if gathering strength and studying their target, and then the first wave launched, and hundreds of ships entered atmosphere across every continent, and the war that Lyria had warned them about finally came to humanity's doorstep. The alien pods crashed into cities and forests and oceans, and when they cracked open, the Zalthun emerged, and they were even worse than the scouts had been, because these were warrior forms bred specifically for combat, and they moved with terrifying speed, and their claws could tear through steel, and their bodies adapted to whatever weapons were used against them. York fell in the first 6 hours, and the Zalthun began converting the city into a hive structure that grew like cancer through the streets and buildings, and the human forces tried to stop them, but conventional weapons barely slowed the enemy. Down and General Hayes ordered a retreat to defensible positions. Ember recovered enough to fly, and despite his damaged state, the dragon took to the skies with a fury that surprised everyone because he was done being cautious, and he was going to make the Zalthun pay for every world they had destroyed. And Jake and Lyria felt his rage through the bond, and it gave them strength. The dragon led squadrons of human fighters in aerial combat, and his plasma breath turned Zalthun ships into falling stars, and pilots reported that following Ember into battle felt like flying with a god. And the dragon seemed to know instinctively where the enemy would be and how to hit them where it hurt. Most, Lyria took command of ground forces alongside Captain Turner, and she fought like the warrior princess she had been born to be. And human soldiers followed her into impossible situations because she never asked them to do anything she would not do herself, and she always brought them home even when it seemed like there was no way out. Jake found himself at NORAD coordinating the global defense, and at first he felt like a fraud, because what did he know about commanding armies? But then he realized that his strength was not in traditional military thinking, and he could see patterns where trained generals saw only chaos, and he started making decisions that seemed crazy, but worked. When the Zalthun took the subway systems in Chicago, Jake ordered the tunnels flooded and drowned thousands of the creatures before they could spread, and when they tried to use tall buildings as hive spires, Jake brought down the structures with controlled demolitions that buried them in rubble, and he turned every city into a weapon against the invaders. Civilians fought too, and Jake saw videos of ordinary people defending their homes with whatever they had, and he saw construction workers using heavy equipment to crush Zalthun warriors, and he saw teachers protecting their students and firefighters, running toward danger instead of away from it, and he understood that humanity might lose this war, but they would never surrender. Colonel Murphy led a desperate mission to destroy a massive hive ship that was hovering over Chicago and pumping out millions of spores to infect the population, and Murphy knew it was a one-way trip, but he took volunteers and they flew a transport loaded with nuclear weapons directly into the ship reactor core. Before the explosion, Murphy sent a final message, and he said he was wrong about everything and he had wasted time being afraid when he should have been fighting. And he told Jake to protect Earth and to never let anyone forget what happened here. And then the transmission cut off and the hive ship exploded like a second sun over the city. Murphy's sacrifice inspired others, and across the world, humans and aliens started working together in ways they never had before. And the Vorai used their crystal technology to create shields for human cities, and the Keth engineered weapons that could penetrate Zalthun armor. And the Elisari taught humans how to fight as a unified force instead of individuals. Jake and Lyria prepared for the most dangerous part of their plan, and they knew the information from the archive had to be used soon, or Earth would fall like every other world before it. And they decided to broadcast everything they had learned about the Zalthun origin and weakness to every ship in the Allied fleet. The broadcast went out on every frequency, and Jake spoke to the combined forces of a dozen species. And he told them that the Zalthun were not invincible, and they had a weakness. And the AI core on their birth world was the heart of the hive mind, and if they could destroy it, the entire swarm would become mindless beasts. Jake said that humanity did not know how to surrender, and they were not going to start now. And every world the Zalthun had taken, and every species they had consumed, deserved justice and vengeance, and the Allied forces would deliver both. And he said they would end this nightmare here and now and for all time. The speech was broadcast across Earth and into space, and it gave hope to people who had none left, and soldiers who were ready to die found reasons to keep fighting, and the Alliance fleet began preparing for an assault on the Zalthun birth world that would either save the galaxy or doom them all. Then sensors detected something new and massive emerging from behind the moon, and it was larger than any ship they had seen before, and it was broadcasting a signal that made Ember scream in pain and caused all Elisari technology to shut down, and every display in NORAD went dark. Dr. Chen managed to get back up, systems online, and what they saw made Jake blood run cold because the Zalthun Queen had arrived, and her ship was the size of a small city, and she was broadcasting a psychic pulse that was specifically designed to disable Elisari systems and Target anyone with a mate bond connection. Through the failing connection, Jake felt leery of fear, and he realized the Queen had come, because she detected the archive being opened, and she knew that Jake and Lyria and Ember had the information that could destroy her, and now her only goal was to capture them and extract that knowledge before they could use it. General Hayes ordered immediate evacuation of Mount Cheyenne, where the command center was located, but Jake refused to run because he knew that if the Queen captured him, she would learn everything, and then she would destroy the archive and eliminate the only weakness the Zalthun had. Lyria appeared beside him, with Ember limping behind her, and her blind eye seemed to glow white in the emergency lighting, and she said through the bond that they had saved each other. The Zalthun Queen ship cast a shadow over Mount Cheyenne that blocked out the sun, and her forces poured down from the sky like a black rain, and they came in waves that seemed endless, and Jake knew this was it, because they either stopped her here or Earth would fall and everything they had fought for would be lost. General Hayes organized a fighting retreat, and she evacuated everyone except a small volunteer force that would stay with Jake and Lyria to defend the command center, and every soldier who stayed knew they were probably going to die, but they stayed anyway because some things were worth dying for. Captain Turner took position at the main entrance with his best fighters, and he set up overlapping fields of fire and prepared traps that would make the enemy pay for every inch of ground they took. And he looked at Jake one last time and said, "It had been an honor serving with the man who taught Earth how to fight back." Lyria stood beside Jake with her energy weapons, charged and ready, and through their damaged mate bond, he could feel her determination mixed with fear, because she knew the Queen was coming specifically for them. And the psychic power of a Zalthun Queen was unlike anything else in the galaxy. Ember launched himself into the air despite his weakened state, and the dragon flew directly at the Queen massive ship. And Jake felt terror spike through the bond, because Ember was too small and too damaged to fight something that size. But the dragon did not care because his bonded family was in danger. Dr. Chen appeared with an idea that bordered on insane, and she explained that star dragons metabolized radiation, and if Ember could absorb enough energy, he might be able to release it as a directed blast that could damage or destroy the Queen ship. And there was a weapons facility nearby with decommissioned nuclear warheads. Jake tried to call Ember back through the bond, but the dragon understood what needed to be done before anyone explained it, and Ember flew toward the weapons facility while Zalthun fighters chased him. And Jake felt every injury the dragon took, and every moment of pain. But Ember kept flying. The dragon reached the facility and began systematically absorbing energy from the warheads, and his body started glowing brighter and brighter until he was visible from space, and the light was so intense it hurt to look at him directly, and Jake could feel through the bond that Ember was holding more power than any living thing should be able to contain. Ember returned to Mount Cheyenne like a falling star and positioned himself between the Queen ship and the mountain, and then he released everything in one massive plasma blast that tore through the sky and slammed into the Queen vessel with the force of a small sun. The explosion lit up the entire continent, and the Queen ship tore apart from the inside as the blast burned through its hull and detonated reactor cores and ammunition stores, and Jake felt the psychic scream of the Queen as she died, and the sound echoed across the mate bond and left him gasping for breath. The dragon fell from the sky smoking and burned but still alive, and he crashed into the forest near the mountain, and Jake and Lyria both felt him hit the ground, and they knew Ember had given everything and might never fly again. But he had done what was needed. With the Queen death, the Zalthun forces on Earth suddenly lost coordination, and they started fighting in confused patterns instead of working together, and the Allied forces saw their chance and pushed back hard, and for the first time since the invasion began, humans and their allies were winning. Captain Turner fleet had launched toward the Zalthun, Earthworld hours earlier, and they jumped through hostile space, losing ships with every light year. But they kept going because this was their one chance to end the war forever. The fleet reached the Earthworld and found a dead planet covered in crystalline structures that housed the ancient AI core, and Turner ordered his ships to provide cover, while a strike team went to the surface, and Lieutenant Claire Brooks volunteered to lead that team, even though everyone knew it was a suicide. Mission Brooks and her team fought through automated defenses and corrupted Zalthun guardians, and they carried the virus that Dr. Chen had created, and it was part human code, and part Elisari quantum encryption, and part star dragon thermal signature. and it could only have been built through the cooperation of three species working together. They reached the AI core and found something horrible, because the core had been harvesting consciousness for thousands of years, and it stored the minds of every being the swarm had consumed, and they were trapped in digital form experiencing eternal suffering. And Brooks realized this was not just destroying a computer, but freeing billions of tortured souls. Brooks uploaded the virus directly into the core, and the structure began collapsing around her, and she sent a final message saying she was glad to have served, and that Earth would remember this day. And then the transmission ended, and the entire crystalline complex shattered and fell across the galaxy. Every Zalthun organism simultaneously went still and dormant as the hive mind AI died, and the swarm did not explode or dissolve, but simply stopped moving and became inert biological matter. And on Earth, millions of alien creatures froze in place and started decaying. The war was over and humanity had won. But the cost had been staggering, and billions of people were dead, and entire cities lay in ruins, and the world would never be the same. But they had survived, and that was what mattered. In the months that followed, Earth and its allies began rebuilding, and the different species worked together to repair the damage and create something new and better than what existed before, and humanity names spread across the galaxy as the species that refused to surrender. Jake and Lyria stepped away from military service because they had earned their peace, and they built a new cabin in the mountains far from the battlefields and from the memories of war, and Ember slowly recovered his strength in the clean mountain air. The dragon grew large enough that the mountain itself became his home, and he would curl around the peak at night like a living fortress. And during the day, he would fly over the valleys, and children would point at the sky and tell stories about the dragon who saved Earth. Lyria told Jake something she had kept secret, and she explained that the mate bond could be broken if both people wanted it, and she had stayed not because of any obligation, but because she loved him truly and completely. And Jake laughed because he had figured that out months ago. Jake said he could have walked away too, but he stayed, because he found where he belonged. And it was not a place, but a person, and that person was Lyria, and together they had become something stronger than either of them could be alone. They received a message from Captain Turner, who had been appointed to lead the new Interstellar Alliance Defense Force, and he wanted Jake and Lyria to serve as advisors because there were more threats in the galaxy and more worlds that needed protecting. Lyria asked Jake if he wanted to go back to war, and he took her hand and felt the mate bond hum warm between them, and he said they had earned their peace and they would let the next generation carry the torch, but they would train those who came after to stand together. Like they had, Jake and Lyria spent their days teaching young soldiers, both human and alien, how to fight as a unified force and how to see past differences and focus on what connected them instead of what divided them. And their students went on to become legends in their own right. In the evenings, they would sit on their porch and watch Ember circle the mountain peaks, and they would share memories through the bond without needing words, and sometimes they would see flashes of possible futures where their children played with young dragons, and the alliance grew stronger with each generation. Mate bond that had formed in desperation and crisis had become something beautiful and permanent. And Jake understood now that it was not about obligation or magic, but about choosing every day to stand beside someone and face whatever came together. Earth had changed and humanity had changed, and they were no longer alone in the universe but part of something larger, and the scars of war remained. But so did the bonds of friendship and alliance that had been forged in fire-on quiet nights. Jake would remember the storm and the crash and the moment he decided to save an alien woman and her dragon, and he would wonder what would have happened if he had made a different choice. But then Lyria would touch his hand, and he would feel the bond flare, warm, and he would know that some things were meant to be. The war was over and the alliance endured, and love had proven stronger than fear. And Jake Morrison, who had been just a rescue specialist, had become a hero and a bridge builder and a symbol of what humanity could be when they chose courage over caution. Lyria, of House Silmara, who had fled her dying world, as one of the last of her kind, had found a new home and a new family and a mate who stood beside her through impossible odds, and she knew her people would be remembered not for how they fell but for how they helped others rise. Ember, the star dragon, who had been small and weak when Jake first saved him, had grown into a force of nature and a legend, and he was proof that even The smallest act of kindness could change the fate of worlds. The three of them, human and alien and dragon, sat together on their mountain and watched the stars come out. And they knew that somewhere up there, other species were watching Earth and wondering about the planet that had refused to fall and the people who fought impossible odds and won.